Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is Mike Consol, your host. In addition to being the producer of this podcast and interviewing novelists, I'm a novelist myself. I've written 4 books, 3 novels, and 1 short story collection. In the episode notes, you'll find a short link to my Amazon page and all 4 of those titles. Now, on with our program. In the spotlight is Alyson Richman. She is a USA Today bestselling and #1 international bestselling author of several historical novels, including The Velvet Hours, The Garden of Letters, and The Lost Wife, which is currently in development for a major motion picture. She graduated from college with a degree in art history and Japanese studies. She is herself an accomplished painter, and her novels combine her penchant for art, historical research, and travel. Her novels have been published in 25 different languages and have reached bestseller lists in both the United States and abroad. She lives on Long Island with her husband and 2 children, where she is currently at work on her next novel. We'll ask her about that. We'll see just how much she can disclose about coming attractions. Alyson Richman, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let me start by asking, where besides the United States does Alyson Richman sell best? Is there a country or 2 that you would point to and say, you know, I really got quite a following here and there?
That's a great question. No one's ever asked me that before. So I think I have 2 countries where I sell just as well and sometimes like even a little better than the United States. And that's in Chile and in Norway. And those are my 2 really big markets outside the United States.
2 very different countries, big sales in both of those countries. You have a good following. Any insight as to why those countries in particular have really taken a liking to your writing?
So, during COVID, I started to receive every week, like several requests from different schools in Chile who had read The Lost Wife, different book clubs that were reading, The Lost Wife or other novels of mine down in Chile. And so when I would have those meetings with them, I always, would sort of ask, especially, when I had a group of students who were reading The Lost Wife for their classroom, and they always at the end would say, do you have any questions for us? And so I remember asking one of the, classes, why do you think my books touch a chord in Chile? And one of the girls said, because your books are so emotional and we love to feel in Chile. We love to have, our emotions of love and loss and hope, evoked when we read. So I think that was really an interesting response. And that was something consistently I heard from different book clubs too, that my writing leans towards the very emotional. With Norway, first of all, Norway has one of the largest reading, populations. I think there have been studies that every 6 minutes, a Norwegian picks up a book or something, and that they have the highest amount of books read per country, or one of the highest countries of reading. Like they're very big readers. So I think that obviously is a component. I think I have been able to travel there and meet with my readers. There's a real genuine curiosity in historical events, in well-researched historical fiction. And so I think, that kind of is sort of the equation, maybe why that particular region seems to sell so many of my books. I mean, obviously I'm happy wherever my books are read, but it's always fascinating when, you're not writing in their mother tongue, and that you write a story that is universal, that no matter where it's read, it touches an emotional chord. That's kind of like one of the nicest things I think you can achieve as a writer, to feel that you're borderless in the effect and the emotion of what you work.
Yeah, one of the gold standards, I would say. So you studied art history. You're a painter. What kind of painting do you do in terms of both subject matter and the material you used? Oil, acrylic, watercolors, and so on.
So, early on when I went to college, I originally wanted to be a fine arts major and concentrate on oil painting. My mother was an abstract oil painter. And when I got to college, I sort of fell in love with art history unexpectedly. One of my professors pulled me aside and said, you have a real gift for bringing the story behind the painting alive, putting it in psychological, perspective between artist and muse, doing the cultural research of when the painting was done. And that sort of opened up this whole other avenue for me. So after graduation, I started writing right away, but I always was painting. I would be the person who always would be traveling. I'd have a sketchbook. I would have a set of watercolors and watercolor, paper with me when I traveled to sort of capture something that moved me that I wanted to go into a book, perhaps, or sometimes just to be able to change the lens of how you see and what you're focusing on. I think any type of artwork is important. I mean, it could be sculpture, it could be sketching, it could be painting. So it's just something that I've always had in my life. Since I've had children, I don't really work in oil paints anymore. It's more like, doing sketches with vine charcoal or pencil or, watercolors that are easy to travel with.
Mm, mhm,
But when
mhm.
my children were younger, of course, I loved doing, our creative things with them and taking my daughter to a museum with a sketch pad and having, sitting there and sculpting maybe a Rodin music sculpture or something lovely like that. But, art gives you the ability to see and change perspective. And I think that's something that really dovetails beautifully when you're writing, to be able to use those same tools.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Where's the nexus between art, fine art, such as painting or pen and ink, and writing?
Mhm.
Um, you already indicated that. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes, I mean, I think it's for me, one of my earliest memories of my mother saying something that became a permanent fingerprint in my mind that was that when you look at artwork, you need to constantly change your perspective. So if you go to the museum and you're looking at a canvas, go up close and really study the brushwork, but then take a few steps away and see how it changes. Or if you see a piece of sculpture, to walk around it and see how something new is revealed in every angle, even like peek underneath and see, did the artist actually do something that isn't, obviously viewable to the audience at first. And so when I'm writing with pen and paper, I am constantly thinking about the change in perspective. I mean, my book, The Timekeepers, that came out this year, it's delving into the Vietnam War from multiple perspectives, whether it's a wounded Vietnam veteran, a Vietnamese refugee child, a housewife, and civilian who has seen her suburban town impacted by the devastation of the Vietnam War. So how do you tell a story from switching perspective and looking at something up close and then giving also a lens where you're stepping away and letting the reader sometimes fill in the blanks. All of those things are just ways of seeing and sharing information with someone who is curious, about what you're working on, I guess, So for me, the nexus seems very natural and very organic between the two. In my own experience, it has a positive impact on whether I'm doing something with a brush or a piece of vine charcoal, or if I'm in front of my computer typing. It's me shifting perspective and trying to share something emotional and impactful with who's ever curious about what I'm doing with my art.
Let me also ask you about Japanese studies. That you
Mhm.
studied that in college. You got a bachelor's degree with that as one of your courses of study. Did was that with a particular intent? Were you going to go to the United Nations or or did you want to
It's
live
a
in
curious
Japan?
thing to see on someone's bio, probably that sort of the combination of Japanese studies and art history, and then you're interviewing a writer. So my family moved to Tokyo when I was 15 years old. I spent 2 years in Japan and then also um, continued Japanese language studies when I finished up my high school education in the United States. And then when I was at Wellesley doing my double major art history Japanese studies, I did a year-long homestay family in Kyoto, Japan. And my mother had always said to me, like, to truly understand another culture, she felt if you could have the possibility or the opportunity to study a traditional art form from that country or that culture, that you should seize that opportunity. So I was really lucky enough during my junior year in college to apprentice myself to a Japanese no mask carver. It's no spelled Noh. It's an ancient form of Japanese theater that has very rich brocaded costumes and carved masks. It's traditionally performed by an all male cast, and there's a certain spiritual component that these masks, when the actor puts them on and arrives on the stage that he believes he's releasing the spirit of that mask and that particular character of the particular play they're performing to the audience. And so these masks are made out of cypress wood. There are only a few. I mean, I did this in 1993. So at that point, there was only a handful of living, what they called, national treasures who still carve these masks for the theater. And I was lucky enough to apprentice myself to a carver by the name of Iwasaki Kyoen. I was one of 4 carvers who studied with him. And it took me 9 months to carve a single mask. No sandpaper was used. You actually carve the mask by looking at, the centuries old mask that's been passed down over generations, and you just have to use your power of observation to recreate it with your chisels. And then you do the ancient form of creating the pigments, first putting the gesso on before you do that. So it's very, very time consuming. You cannot make a mistake. I was sweating bullets as I was doing it every afternoon after my classes. But that experience really was the spark that got me into writing historical fiction, because that junior year abroad, being in that very close-knit classroom with this carver and teacher, I started to think, well, here I am, a Western woman studying a traditional art form. When did Japanese art form, when did the reverse occur? When did the first Japanese artists start studying European art? And when you take art history classes, especially when you get to the Impressionist period, you learn so much about how so many different Impressionists were influenced by the Japanese at that moment, that there was an influx of there was a term called Orientalism. We don't really say that anymore, but, Japanese, things that were coming from the Far East into Europe. And, you'll see Monet's wife in a kimono with cherry blossoms. You'll see Van Gogh's painting with Japanese characters around it, or he'll do plum blossom trees that are very evocative of, certain Japanese traditional painters. But did anyone ever look at that from the reverse of Japanese artists being impacted by French painters? And so I wanted to sort of focus in on this very unique period of Japanese history, which happened in the late 1860s. In 1868, Japan was opened up to basically for Japanese people to travel to Europe and Europeans to come to Japan, because prior to that, they practiced an isolationist policy of the Meiji period. So Meiji period now, changes. In 1868, the port, before there was only one port in Nagasaki where Dutch traders were allowed in, but no one from France or England could have come prior to that. So my first novel was called The Mask Carver's Son, and that is about a Japanese artist, a young man who's born into a traditional Japanese art, no carving family, who dreams of going to Europe and painting with basically in the Impressionists. And so he is able to get to Europe and study, but he's unable to sort of escape his outsidership. The novel is really about, his yearning to be a French painter, but knowing he's always physically and visually Japanese to all the Frenchmen. And yet when he comes back to Japan, he's been imprinted with European life and he's different there as well. And so this sort of journey of an artist, a journey of a man who doesn't feel that he has any country. And then, most important, it's a journey of a father and son who are both artists, but who have 2 very different artistic passions. His father is this traditional no mask carver, and he yearns to be something very different and break the predestiny that, has always been expected of him. So I published that in my mid-20s, and I have been publishing a historical novel ever since. That's a very long answer to your question about my Japanese studies, but it basically comes from my early college education and experience in Japan.
When did you know you wanted to be a writer, and was there a triggering event?
I always loved telling stories. I think I'm a natural storyteller. I'm naturally curious. I think it really was after majoring in art history that my father kind of was like, well, what are you going to do with that? Or, are you going to take Japanese language and do something practical? Or are you going to do something creative? And this ability for me to have this idea that I wanted to work on a novel that kind of blended those 2 interests. And then I just got this bug where I was very interested in whether I could create a career in which every novel that I write begins with a question that I don't know the answer to. So um, it's about pursuing that question, trying to find the answer to it, and putting it typically against a historical backdrop that the reader learns something that they didn't know before they opened up the first page.
So what was the pending question when you launched into The Lost Wife?
Mm-hmm. That question was, it happened. I mean, the question occurred to me right after the birth of my second child when I was struggling to find childcare and sufficient childcare to write every day. And I was sitting at the computer saying to myself, Alyson, don't feel badly for yourself. This is, basically a privileged question to say to yourself, when am I going to be able to write because I don't have a babysitter? And then my mind sort of wandered to this idea, well, what happened in the darkest period that you can imagine, the darkest period of history? Were artists still able to create if all of their resources were taken away from them? And I started to just ponder this, question, were artists able to create in the concentration camps? Did they, if they were painters, did they somehow find clandestine supplies and paint? If they were sculptors, did they find clay? I didn't know the answer to it. And then as I started researching that question, I learned about this particular concentration camp called Theresienstadt, where there was a group of resistance artists who were forced to do propaganda artwork for the Germans in this particular camp, but often stole the supplies to do their own artwork and to bury it in the walls and in different parts of the camp. And that there was also an art teacher there who would take some of the supplies and use them for the first known art therapy with children. And so that was like the question for that book, and became much more. I mean, the novel has many different layers, but it all gestated from that first initial question.
Now, am I correct? Is The Lost Wife's your most recent novel? Is that right?
No, The Lost Wife came out in 2011. So The Timekeepers, which is my Vietnam book, just came out in October. So I've written, this is probably, I mean, it would have been my fourth novel, The Lost Wife. And
Okay. How many do you have right now?
I have 10, I think, out.
10 of them. Wow, you're
There's a
productive.
lot. There's a
And
lot. Yeah.
and so it's The Lost Wife that's being made into a motion picture, is that right?
Yes, that's in development to be a film. Yes.
In development. So it will be, is it going to be on one of the streaming channels, or is it going to go to the theaters? Do you know what
I
the
mean,
plan is?
at this point, we don't know. We have a script, we have a director, and a producing team, but we haven't gotten so far of where it will stream or whether it'll be independently released. So that's why it says development when it's further into, I think,
Development, not
production.
production,
Yeah, into
right?
production. Yeah, exactly. Once you get
So
to production, you have more of sense.
yeah, so did you have any involvement in the script other than, I mean, obviously you wrote the book, the script's based on the book, but did they come to you and say, we'd like you to work with a screenwriter to put the script together? Or was that done separately from you?
So, I have a wonderful working relationship with the screenwriter. His name is Mark Klein. He did a wonderful job on the script. And we have a wonderful rapport that we talk about the script and certain points and things, that are in the book and things that have been changed in the script, mostly because of time constraints. So I'm part of the creative collaboration, but I'm not the one responsible for writing the script. So I'm just basically part of his think tank.
Okay, so he will ask you questions and
Yes,
such.
absolutely. Yes,
Yeah, he
absolutely.
wants to understand
Yeah, yeah.
certain
He's been
nuances
very
and
like collaborative
yeah.
in that way. Yes.
Okay, okay. So the um interesting. I heard you say
Hmm.
on I dipped into a podcast or two where you had said, I've been doing this my whole adult life. If you're at a cocktail party and somebody says, oh, hi, Allison, they've just met you, they don't know who you are. What do you
Hmm.
do? What do you say?
I say I'm a writer. I say I'm a writer. And then if they ask any more, I say I write historical fiction.
Got you. Okay. Okay. So, talk about the research involved in historical fiction. I mean, how much research you do is travel? I see that travel is something that you like to do. I don't know if
Mhm.
that's purely pleasure or that is also part of your research.
Mhm.
And do you do the entirety of your research before you start writing?
I do the most of my research before I start writing because I feel it impacts the overall structure of how I want to tell the story. I need to sort of know as much as possible about what I'm writing about before I start writing a single sentence. I mean, I see writing historical fiction as building out a whole universe, so in order to do that, I have to feel really comfortable about the time period that I'm writing about. So it almost always involves traveling to the country that I'm writing about. There's only 2 books out of 10 that I didn't go to the country that I was writing about. Um, I love going to the country, not just because I love travel, but I love meeting people who are connected to the history, who are willing to share their stories with me that I can put into the novel. I think that's a very, very special part of the process. I also, because I'm such a visual learner, looking at the landscape, eating the food, inhaling the scents, observing the textures and the palette of the country are really important for recreating those scenes where I'm trying to make the reader feel as though they are walking through the footsteps of my character, with them. So, as if they share the same lens. So going there and seeing and recording it in my mind so I can recreate it is really important. And of course, I just love a good adventure.
Who doesn't? Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
So, what is your obligate? What do you see as your obligation to your readers? And
Hmm.
I ask that because I think we've all had the experience of we find an author who we really like. Maybe the first couple of books we've read and they're terrific. Then the third book comes out and we're not thrilled with it. We're disappointed with it. What do your readers expect from you, or what do you see as your obligation to your readers?
Hmm. So I feel that my obligations to my readers that I'm going to really make sure that my historical research is sound, that I don't take liberties or that distort history or things that really happened. I really, for the most part, have always tried to be fastidiously accurate to things that have happened in history. I think having now written 10 novels, I am not a novelist who likes to be pigeonholed to only write a particular time period. I really like to write from anything from Meiji period Japan to the Pinochet regime in South America to, the Finnish Winter War, Chernobyl. I've done so many different books at this point in my career, and with everyone, I'm learning and really trying to share with my readers something that they might not have known had they not picked up one of my novels. So I feel very responsible to that too, that I'm going to be taking you on a journey to a place or a period of history that you might not know anything about, but that you're going, by the time you finish the last page, you will have learned something and become emotionally tethered to characters that feel real and, you know, palpably interesting to you that you don't put the book down and not want to finish it. So I guess those are what I feel is my responsibility. I don't like to be formulaic in any way, so I really try not to be repetitive and or have say that I always have to make sure there's a love story or there's this I don't have a recipe. I just have a code of honor of what I'm going to do with each book.
Interesting. So do you consider yourself, I mean, just based on what you just said, I'm wondering if you consider yourself a genre writer or not.
Hmm.
I mean, you could say, well, yeah, I'm a genre writer. I write historical fiction. On the other hand, genre writing tends to be formulaic, and that's exactly what you don't want.
Yeah, so probably not. I probably don't consider myself
We'll just
a
settle
genre.
this right now.
Yeah, I
You're,
mean, I write books that have a historical backdrop, but I definitely don't see myself as writing something that has a formula.
so
I don't even I don't even use an outline when I write. Like I approach writing very much the way I would approach a painting, where it's built sentence upon sentence, the way a painting is brushstroke upon brushstroke, and pausing and meditating and thinking about it as I'm doing it. I'm not one of those writers who makes a board out and says, and then, this is going to happen, then this is going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. I just know that I've done the research and I know the message and the question that I started with, the message I want to kind of relay in the novel, the spiritual message. And I know the ending. I never start until I know how I'm going to end because it's this journey of having to get to that place, but I don't know the road. So I don't see how it could be formulaic if I don't know the road.
Yeah, no, not if no, yeah, not if you're letting your characters dictate.
Mm,
Um, you said spiritual.
mhm.
Talk about that. In each of your books, you feel that that's an element that's an indispensable element of your storytelling or not?
Yes, I think so. And it might be only spiritual to me. I don't know if someone else would pick it up as they were reading it. But for me, I write every novel thinking it's the last novel I'm going to write. Like I think there's an element of being a novelist where you're almost thinking always that you might not live to finish your next book. It sounds very overly dramatic, but I just think, having been in the business of storytelling as long as I have, I know I could get hit by a bus tomorrow or I could be diagnosed with something terrible. So I always feel like the respect towards writing something that might be my last words here on earth, um, it evokes in something with me with the text that I really feel that I need to put my soul into the book, that there's something
Hmm.
of me that, and as I've mentioned before, the message of that book. What is the message, So um, my most recent book, which I mentioned before, The Timekeepers, that does center around this small town and this cast of different characters who have been impacted by the Vietnam War. I worked with, five members of a single platoon, each of them sharing something different, of what happened to them there, but also without the others knowing about what they were sharing with me. They all mentioned, for example, one of their fallen comrades, a man named Stanley Copes. And when I listened to them, each one of them told me something I didn't know, whether it was the one who was with him when he was shot down and when he, asked for his Bible, they reached for it and put it on his chest, whether it was the man who was carrying him up to the helicopter, remembered how the clouds opened up as the helicopter came down, all these little details that for me it was about preserving in the book this 17-year-old who died on the hills of Vietnam, that he was still remembered by these men. And so I actually, use his name in the book, and he becomes this other layer within the novel. He's not a main character, but he's a character in the wounded Vietnam veteran's memory, but he's a composite of four different men. So that type of thing of being very conscious of the people who share their stories with you, their memories, often their trauma, having this code of doing it respectfully and making sure that when they read the book, they're going to see their fallen comrade honored in a very respectable way, and knowing that this book will, most likely, outlive them. That sounds very melodramatic, but hopefully the book still exists after, you know, so many decades. So that type of feeling when I'm writing really comes over me, this way, I like to call it this sort of palimpsest of memory, these engravings in the text of people who have lived through this and how I share that with my reader. And that's what I think evokes emotion, because it's not coming so far from the left field that it could never happen. It's coming for me to share something that did happen. And yes, my characters are invented, but they have to come from a place of research and a place of listening. So that's what I mean, if that makes
Hmm.
sense.
Hmm. It does. So let's talk about the progression. You come
Mhm,
up with an idea. There's the question
mhm,
to be resolved. You
mhm,
do your research, figure out the potential parameters of the story, and then you sit to begin the writing process, I'm assuming. What
mhm.
is your routine? What's your writing routine when you're in the throes of writing a novel?
My writing routine. So I really feel to to be successful at this, and I don't mean success financially, I just mean to like finish a novel, you have to be consistent. You can't just, every few months write a few chapters. You have to treat it like a day job. So, since the moment I started writing The Mask Carver's Son at 23 years old, I had designated hours every day that I wrote for 5 days a week. During COVID, I worked 7 days a week and I worked on two different books. But for the most part, that regimented schedule of getting up, having breakfast, sitting down at the computer, working for 4 to 5 hours, and then calling it a day. And then the next morning, getting up again and rereading what I wrote the day before, revising what I wrote the day before, and then writing some new pages. So it's a little bit two steps back, one step forward every day because I'm rewriting or revising what I wrote the day before, realizing it could be improved. But by the time I get to the last page, of writing a novel, it doesn't need a lot of work because it's been this constant wheel of revision writing, revision writing, revision writing. So
But you're doing 4 or 5 hours a day, you
yeah,
said.
I am at this point in my life with grown children. Yes. It was much, I wrote two novels before I had children. And then my third and, novel became the first novel I wrote with my son. And then The Lost Wife I wrote with two children. And ever since The Lost Wife came out in 2011, I've had children at home until last year. So, but once they got to school, I could write 4 or 5 hours. I wrote from the minute they got on the school bus to the minute they came home. Once they came home, I stopped writing. But I was always writing, even when I wasn't in front of the computer. I'd be thinking about what I had to write the next day or thinking about something that wasn't working in the book. And when my children were young and I could only write 1 or 2 days a week when I had a babysitter, I remember being in the shower and thinking to myself, okay, when I have Wednesday and I have, childcare coverage, I need to write this. Or when I was, taking my, giving my son a bath, I would be, pouring the water and shampooing his hair, but my mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about what I was, when I had time, I was going to actually physically write it, but I was writing mentally.
Yeah, it incubates. It
Yeah,
incubates in
exactly.
the
Exactly.
unconscious or subconscious mind, or consciously. You may be working on it when you're doing something repetitious like shampooing the baby's hair or washing dishes. Yeah,
Right.
you got the mind space for that. So you're currently doing maybe 4 to 5 hours a day. Are you a morning writer, midday, evening? What's your sweet spot?
I'm a civilized writer. So I like to, get up at 8, be in front of the computer till 9, 3 or 4 o'clock, start winding down, so around that. I think that's my best. Now I start around 9 now that I don't have children home. I probably start around 8:30, 8 o'clock, 8:30 when I have them at home. And then, but still, they would always come home between 2:30 and 3. So it was now I might write
Yeah.
an hour longer, but it's pretty still much the same. I'm not someone who can get up at, when it's dark and start writing. And I'm not someone who, after 3 o'clock, my brain is working very well. By that time, I can barely string two words together after
Oh
writing.
yeah. Well, you've been writing for hours at
Yeah,
that
yeah,
point. So yeah, you
yes,
need to
yeah,
do something different.
yeah, totally different.
Yes, it is non-communication.
Yes, exactly.
Um, so a lot of people cannot write without an outline. You do that.
Yes.
So I would imagine that there's certain. I'm just thinking in terms of the pitfalls that there can be stretches of the book where you've overexpanded on something. Now, like you say, there's rewriting too. So when you write I think it takes you what 2 to 3 years to complete a novel. Is that right? Is that your time frame basically? Two
When
to
I had
three.
children at home, it was 2 to 3 years. Now I could probably do it in about 18 months if I could,
Ah, it's accelerated.
yeah,
Okay.
it is accelerated. Yeah.
So you've got talk a little bit about. I mean, I tried writing without the first two efforts I made without an outline, and I don't use heavy outlines, but I wrote myself into a corner and just decided I had to abandon the project. How do you
Mhm.
keep yourself from doing that? I mean, does part of your incubation process or your thinking process when you're just standing in line at the store, maybe, are
Mhm.
you kind of doping out the next 20 or 50 pages in your own mind? To what degree do you plan before you're actually sitting down that day and writing?
So I really very, very abstract. It's really an idea or like a scene, oh, that would be a great scene to do. But I could never do 20 or 30 pages like that in my head, dope it out like you said. The only time
So you're
something
going
like
scene by scene. You're,
Yeah,
you're
I'm
thinking
doing
in terms of scene by
100%,
scene.
chapter by chapter, and my chapters are usually 3 to 5 pages. They're short chapters, and I always call them mini canvases. So that's always been my way of going, and it's a way that enables me to maintain joy and surprise when I'm writing. I'm a very sensitive reader when I read other people's books, and I typically get a slightly claustrophobic when I feel I'm being led with a very short leash through scenes. So I like to feel that anything could possibly happen, that you're like they're broad strokes of storytelling. And you're not until you get to the last page do you know the full circle that I've created for you of how everything comes together.
So,
And
like at the canvas, broad
mhm,
strokes.
mhm,
Uh, it could even be like, say, a gesture drawing, and then
mhm.
you start filling in details. Do you feel like you're doing broad strokes and then you're filling in the
That's a
details?
great question. So it's almost that the strokes are still detailed, but they're not necessarily action strokes. They're strokes of creating the human essence of who the character is, or there's strokes of creating the place so that you can visualize it. Um, so it's not so tight, I guess is the right word.
Hmm.
It's more impressionistic the way I write. So the only time I can tell you that it was much more controlled and scripted is when I did a collaboration with a friend of mine named Shauna Edwards. We wrote a book called The Thread Collectors, which is a Civil War novel that basically looks at an unexpected friendship between a Black Union musician and a Jewish Union musician, both of them in the Union Army, when I say Union musician, and how they meet on the battlefields of Louisiana. And it has a lot of backstory of who their beloveds are and their history before they get to this place of meeting. But in order to work on a novel with another person, we had to kind of discuss, I would say 20, what would be in text about 20 pages plot wise, because we couldn't possibly start writing on something where the other person, you weren't somehow a little bit in the other person's head of where you were inching towards to get to the end, right? So that was a little different. We didn't have an actual outline, but that was during COVID. Every Sunday night, we'd sort of talk about, okay, this is where I see the characters going. And we wrote the book together. Like it was a Google Doc with one, and there's only one voice. It wasn't that we took different chapters and, I'd write a chapter, she'd write a chapter. We wrote each chapter looking at it together. I would usually do the first pass of it, then she would put her layer into it, often adding, she was from the South, different dialect, different descriptions of New Orleans because she was from there. But it was this, building block against over building block rather than I wouldn't have used the metaphor of brushstrokes and the abstraction that I'm comfortable working with when I can hold something in my head.
Hmm. Hmm. So let's take the Timekeepers. That weighs in at what, 350 to 400 pages.
Mhm.
How many pages did you write versus what you finished with? I mean, do you tend to write a lot more copy than you keep, or are
No,
you okay?
no.
So you're very careful about
Yes. I
you're
don't
not
write about
riffing.
that. No, no, never, never. I would never do that. No. I mean,
Why would you never riff?
I would never riff. I could spend 8 hours on 4 sentences in a day. Like I'm
Okay,
very,
so you're more
yeah,
like Tom Robbins used to say, he only gets a paragraph done a day, but when he gets it done, it's done.
yeah,
It's he
pretty
makes sure
much.
that I don't need to
Yeah.
rewrite those sentences.
I mean, the next day I often, when I say revise the next day, I often read out loud what I've written the day before because I can hear if there's, word to an extra word or a missing word, the beat, like there's a cadence to or a
Yeah,
lyricism that I like. But there's
rhythm's
never,
important.
yeah, there's never a lot of, there's never an excess of text where I've overwritten. There are times though that when in the second day that I'm reading what I wrote the day before, where I'll say to myself, again, I'm always going to return to the artistic metaphors, but I could bring a little bit more. I don't know if you're going to be able to go there with me, but I want to say light, like a shimmering light to a particularly beautiful sentence by cutting away sentences that might bookend it, if that makes any sense to you. That I might have, it might kind of
Might bookend
shine.
what though?
Yeah.
The
But like,
section, the paragraph.
not, no, it would not be a bookended with content. It would be if I had overly, in 3 sentences, I described the sun when I only needed one perfect sentence about the sun. So I'll look at those 3 sentences, say, this is the one I really want to focus on. So I'm going to cut away those 2 sentences. But it's not that I've necessarily overwritten. It's more that I like this sense of that particular sentence coming out to you in
Right.
high relief,
Yeah.
that you're not bogged down by anything that kind of goes uh, on either side of it. So
You
there's
want a
this,
very you want a very distinct
yes, and
you might have a just a couple marks of distinction for the character that it's the arrow it's an arrow strike, and then from there, I mean, you're trusting your reader, it sounds like, because they'll know what to do with that character from there. Their
yes,
imagination goes to work
yes,
along with you.
yes. And this is something that definitely has changed over, my 25 years of writing. I mean, when you look at my first novel, The Mask of Our Sun, and you look at my most recent one, The Timekeepers, The Mask Cover Sun is written in a very dense, descriptive way. It's much more saturated with description than The Timekeepers. There's a lot more negative space around the descriptions, and that kind of goes into what I was just talking about. The
Mm.
older I get, the more I like it pared down. Um,
Why do you think that is? Has
yeah,
minimalism has set in
yes,
as you've gotten
yes.
older?
I think
And what does it? Yeah, go ahead. You said I think. What do you think?
I Honestly, I think that once I became a mother and I had so many things going on in my life that were not necessarily connected to my writing, my brain was attracted to really finely chiseled prose, that there wasn't a lot of unnecessary, like there wasn't a single unnecessary word. And I
Hmm.
just really like that. I like that simplicity. Um, there are people who tell me that, The Mask Cover Sun is their most favorite book, and they love that. I appreciate the book, and I don't think I would have written it any differently, but I don't think that I could read that book very quickly the way that I would want to be able to read a book now. And when I say quickly, I don't mean like my books are light or they're not heavy in theme or the writing isn't beautiful, but it is sparser. It's more like a haiku than, a 600 page book.
Right, right. I get it. I get it. And that relates also to painting, where
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
mean, clearly in the visual arts or
Hmm.
fine arts, yeah, there's a difference between something very lush and something that's very austere and
Hmm.
gives you a whole different vibe.
Hmm.
So I'm going to ask you a question most authors don't like to
Hmm.
answer, and that is that what if you were to be remembered for a novel that you've written to date? Which one do you think where you are at the apex of your writing ability or power, storytelling power, um, which I would assume would be the same thing, that, this is the one that I think I really hit my stride or my peak in of the 10 I've done so far. And that's the one I'd be remembered for if I never wrote another stitch.
Um, it's a complicated question. I know that's not what you're going to answer because
Your writing has
I
changed over the
don't.
years. You've already said
Yeah,
that too.
exactly.
So you have to ask
It's
yourself
yeah, yeah. So
which
are you
version
asking
of myself?
are you asking me the question, which book do I think the writing is the best, or is it the book that I want to be remembered for the most? Because I don't necessarily
Well,
think
let's
they're
do
the
both.
same
What do you want to
answer.
be remembered for the most?
So I think The Lost Wife would be the novel that I will be remembered for the most and probably want to be remembered for the most.
And not because it's got a motion picture in development.
No, no, no,
It has
not at
nothing to
all.
do with that.
Not at all. Not at
What's the
all.
best written novel? What's your most beautifully written novel, do you think, or the one that where the writing you felt like, wow, I was locked in on this one?
I would say The Timekeepers, my most recent one. That to me
Uh-huh.
is where the writing style and also the one that's coming out next October, The Missing Pages, that too. Those two books I feel really embody the way I want my writing to be remembered. So yeah, those, it's not a singular book that I can say encapsulates all the questions of that you've asked, but
Yeah, yeah. So how do you determine I actually, let me ask it this way. Are you a person who you already know that there's, two or three or five different stories that you would like to tell? You already have them set aside as
Mhm.
future novels. Not that you're committed to them. You might change along the way because you come across some new material or some new thinking. Uh, do you plan that far out? not even planning. It's just you run into ideas and they accumulate.
Mhm.
That's not the original question I was asking. What I really want to ask you, Alyson, is the how do you determine what you want to write about? Obviously, it's historical fiction, but there's so much history that you could be writing about, and you have to make choices.
Mhm.
What are the factors that get you to say this is the subject?
Mhm. So, I mean, my answer does kind of connect to the other part of your question, which is that yes, I do at every time in my life have at least three other ideas for another book. But I have to feel in my bones, literally like it's something in the air, the zeitgeist that this is the time now to sit down and write that book. And there have been times where I thought it was the right time to do a book. And yet something in my bones was like, no, no, I don't think it's the right time. Like my Civil War idea, like, and eventually became the Thread Collectors. I had wanted to write a Civil War book probably for 10 or 15 years. I had a personal connection to the Civil War. My grandmother would always tell me these really colorful stories growing up that on our family tree, I had two great uncles who fought on opposite sides during the Civil War. One of them was a musician in the Union Army, and that their relationship was never repaired, that we had nothing to do with the Southern side of our family. So that was like always in my head, but I did not feel it was the right time to write that book until 2020. So I do feel I walk through life feeling a sensitivity towards things that people might appreciate learning about at that particular time. There's always things that I personally think are interesting, but why now? And I think what's really interesting with both The Lost Wife and now my book, The Timekeepers, both of those books originally, I was told by either publishers or my agent, when I originally had the idea, I don't know if that's going to sell. Um, you know, The Lost Wife delves into the Holocaust. At that time, when I started writing it in 2000, researching it in 2006, there had never really been World War II historical fiction that delved into the Holocaust if you were not someone who was personally connected to it. It really wasn't until like 2010 where I think Sarah's Key came out, the things started to change. And then it became like, the doors blew open. And, for the past 5 years, we've had so much, historical fiction that's been written about that time period. But I stuck to it. And like just like writing a book about the Vietnam War, when I was working on that in 2021, I was told no one's going to want to read about the Vietnam War. It's too heavy. There's a lot of shame connected to it. But there's two things that I think happen. One is the sense that now both of those particular periods of history have passed their 50-year anniversary of having happened. I think we just celebrated the 50, you'd have to check my math, but 51 years after the end of the Vietnam War. I think you have a whole generation of people who didn't know about it, wasn't taught about it in school, and yet you had a whole generation of people who were survivors, who were people who had been soldiers or had been impacted if they lived in, Vietnam, or if they had been refugees, and were coming to an age where they felt that they could share their story. People who are grandparents now, who are facing their own mortality. So rather than me asking you to interview a soldier who's freshly come home, like, as if I was, it's the difference. But am I going to find a soldier who was in Afghanistan who wants to share his PTSD with me, compared to a 75-year-old man who's thinking, if I don't actually now tell my story, it's going to be forgotten. Uh, one of those soldiers, former veterans, told me, I've never shared this story with anyone, but I've started to think of the Chinese proverb that when an old man dies, he takes with him his whole library. And that's why he was ready now to finally talk about what happened to him. And the same thing with when I was researching the Holocaust with The Lost Wife, people who never shared what happened to them to their children or their grandchildren because they didn't want to burden them with the trauma that they experienced. They just wanted to focus on their new life and, their blessings after having suffered through that. But with someone like me, they were willing, for the sake of history, to tell their story to make sure it was recorded. So I think that's that kind of is important. You have to kind of like nail it at the right time where people are also willing to tell their story. It doesn't always happen that that's the right time your representation is going to tell you that that story is going to sell. So it's like a collecting of the information, a writing of it, and then the hoping that when it comes out, the world is ready to hear that story. With the Timekeepers, I was so excited when Kristen Hanna wrote The Women because people became so interested in learning more about this war. And, her book delves into a different perspective than, the nurses who were over there helping and contributing to the war effort. But if that book hadn't come out several months before mine, I don't know if my book would have done as well as it has. So those are unexpected things that can happen, but I guess you have to just be sensitive to yourself if this is the time that you want to sit down and write this book and hope that everything kind of comes together.
I love that Chinese proverb. When no man
Yeah,
dies, he takes with him his whole library.
yeah,
That's the truth.
that's in all. Mm.
Was there a turning point in your writing life, a point at which something happened, or there was an epiphany of some kind, or you got a piece of advice, Alyson, that made change the direction of your writing or brought it into fuller realization?
Hmm. I mean, it goes back to what I said before, that I really do feel that I'm always writing my last novel. And my mother would tell you that I've always been someone who kind of recognized how short life is. Um, and that was something that before I had any sort of personal illness or before I came a mother, it was just something inherent to who I was as a human. So that sense of the fragility of life and knowing that even if we live to 100, sometimes it doesn't feel like you've had enough time. So I think for me, it's not something that necessarily one singular thing happened that changed how I see writing, but I've always felt that I wanted to leave a little something that was beautiful and reflective of who I am behind when I'm no longer here. This is something, and that has always propelled me to sit down every day and to write.
Interesting. So, your writing has evolved over time. You're more um, spare with your writing, a little more
Mhm.
minimalist with your writing. As you get older, do you think there's going to be yet another stage? How will your writing, I guess the simple way to ask you this is, how will your writing change as you get older? Do you have any sense of that? Maybe based on how it's changed already, but I don't
Yeah,
know,
I mean, I'm
maybe
pretty old now, Mike. So
you don't look old, Alyson.
don't go outside much. So, um, I know it's unusual because probably to interview someone like me because I started so young, right? I started my first novel at 23, it came out when I was 26. I've had a book come out almost, consistently every 2 to 3 years. So there's a lot that I've done in the short amount of time. And I recognize that. And I'm very, very grateful that I've had that chance to be able to share that many stories with the world. Um, I think the one thing I can say is that I continually want to search for stories that have not been told before, that are like these small footnotes in a big text where you read something and no one's ever written about that little footnote about something, and expanding that and exploring that and learning about that and then trying to write a novel about that. That really is my fuel. Uh, so how do I think things will change as I get older? Um, I mean, my husband would tell you that he thinks I'm going to be busier than ever because I have a lot of energy, and now that the children are outside of the house, that you'll probably be seeing a lot
Yeah.
more
Oh, I
stories.
can hear it. I can hear
Yeah,
the energy. You
right.
definitely
And
do.
I'll be more productive than ever. I think hopefully that will happen. I will have a book that comes out next year, and I just, signed a contract for another book that'll come out, that I'll turn in 16 months. It'll be 2 more years before it comes out. So I have things lined up. They're all different. And
Talk about your next one, the one you're working on right now. What can you tell us about it?
well, the book, that will come out in October. It's called The Missing Pages. It's done. I just am waiting for the copy edits. It's my first book that has a slightly supernatural element to it. So it's, again, something different for me. It's based on a legend at Harvard College about a graduate there who perished on the Titanic. His name was Harry Elkins Widener. He was 27 years old, an avid book collector who went over to London to, buy several rare and precious books for his collection, one particular book in particular. And he went with his parents who were going to London, but also going to France, because his sister was getting married a few months later, and they were getting things for her trousseau and things for their summer house in Northport. I mean, not Northport, in Newport. When you take a tour at Harvard, the tour guide will stand in front of the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library, and he will tell, prospective students that this library was built by Harry Elkins Widener, who, as I mentioned before, perished on the Titanic at the age of 27, but whose mother built it in his honor to house his book collection after he drowned. And at the center of the library is a reconstruction of his childhood, or his 20-year self-study with the original desk, and his chair, his books, on all the shelves. And in the behest, it stipulates that every week the librarian at Harvard has to put fresh flowers at his desk, hoping, to evoke the feeling that he might sit down at any moment and read. And then a legend will be shared that there was room on his mother's lifeboat for him to get on board, but that he told his mother he was going back to his cabin to retrieve a very rare book, and he was never seen again. So when my daughter was applying to college, and she actually was on the tour listening to this, I wasn't with her. She came home and she told me this story, and she said, "Isn't this an incredible story that his mother built this library and he didn't get on the boat because he went back for this rare book?" And I said to my daughter initially, "Oh, I'm sure he just said that because it was such a painful goodbye to his mother and he wanted to be a gentleman and stay on board with the other men, that he said that as an excuse, so that she would be lowered safely into the water." But then I started thinking, is there any credibility to this legend? I mean, was there a very rare book that he would have risked his life to go back and retrieve? And I learned that there was, in fact, a very rare book that he had just purchased. It was a 16th century copy of Francis Bacon's essays. Actually, I think it was so small, it was the size of a baseball card with gilded edges. And there's correspondence. I went to London. I found correspondence leading up to his purchase of it at the bookseller Quaritch in London. And it was never found. His body was never found. And I started to think, wouldn't it be an interesting novel if you wrote this real story of what happened leading up to his purchase of this novel? I mean, this book of essays in London, and his last moments on the Titanic, from the voice of his ghost at the library his mother built for him. So it's my first ghost story, but it's also a Titanic story, a book about mother and son grief. It's also an unexpected love story. So it was wonderful to write in first person as a ghost in a library.
Gotcha. Let me just a couple more questions, Alyson. What is your state of mind when you're writing? Is there anything that you bring to the desk that do you try to put yourself in a certain mind frame when you're getting ready to start putting the prose on the screen or paper?
Yeah, there is a certain mind frame. I kind of like to keep myself in this almost like gauzy state of mind where almost like you've just waken up and awoken and you have this dreamy quality in your head where you're not bogged down yet on the aggravation of the daily world. Like I would never read the newspaper and then sit in front of the computer and write what I needed to write that day. So I try and maintain a very dreamy, almost gossamer-like lens to how I'm seeing my characters and the scenes before I start writing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Dreamy, gossamer,
Mhm.
absolutely. Interesting. I've never had that answer before, but it makes sense. No, I like that.
Mm.
Um, so to the aspiring novelist out there,
Mhm.
looking at you and thinking that's where I want to be, down the road. What's your best piece of advice to the aspiring novelist out there?
Hmm. My best piece of advice is to create manageable expectations for yourself. So don't feel that you have to sit down and write every day 3 or 4 pages, 10 pages, whatever you think is what you should be writing. The most important thing is every day to try to sit down and write something. Again, whether it's 3 sentences, 1 sentence, half a paragraph, it can be minimal, but eventually you will build out a novel if you do it consistently. So for me, it's about dedication and diligence. It's I wish I could say it's for, if you're, creative and you're imaginative, that's going to finish a book, but it's not. It's going to be the person who turns down the lunch with a friend or doesn't go out late the night before and is hungover the next morning. You have to have a pretty regimented life, I think, if you really want to get things done.
Hmm. Gotcha. Okay, well, my guest has been Alyson Richman, author of 10 novels. Her 11th is coming out in October of this year.
Mhm.
She's got another one with her one of her earlier novels. What was it? Your third novel is in development. Hopefully, will be a motion picture or a series on one of the streaming channels. Still
Mhm.
to be determined. Alyson, oh, and by the way, for our listeners, did want to say Alyson's URL for her website. If you want to learn more about her and look at her full catalog of books, that's in the episode notes. Alyson, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was a wonderful hour chat, and I really appreciate all your wonderful questions.